Zefta stood before the massive viewing screen in the High Council chamber and watched the swirling nebulae beyond. His forearms crossed behind his back in the traditional pose of attention while the council members whispered among themselves in their ancient language. After 30 years of military observation across the galaxy, he had seen every type of warfare imaginable. The Bruthen with their massive siege weapons that could crack planets. The Silari who fought with pure energy and could burn entire fleets in seconds. The machine races that calculated every move with perfect precision. He had documented them all and returned with detailed reports that helped the Galactic Federation decide which species deserved membership and which posed threats. The head counselor finally spoke, and her voice echoed through the chamber with the weight of authority that came from leading a civilization spanning thousands of worlds. She told him about a new species that had recently achieved faster than light travel and made contact with Federation scouts. These creatures called themselves humans and came from a small blue world orbiting a yellow star in what they named the Sol System. The initial reports seemed routine enough. Carbon-based life forms with bilateral symmetry, average height around 6 feet. Single head with 2 eyes and basic sensory organs. They breathed oxygen and required water to survive. Nothing unusual about their biology suggested they would be particularly dangerous. But then came the concerning reports from first contact teams. 3 different Federation survey ships had encountered human vessels in what should have been peaceful meetings. Each time the humans had responded to perceived threats with violence that seemed far beyond what the situation required. Captain Vorth of the exploration vessel Seeker described how human warships had surrounded his ship when he tried to scan their colony world. The humans had not fired first, but their weapon systems had been more advanced than expected, and their tactical formations suggested military experience that a newly spacefaring race should not possess. The Council needed answers before they could decide whether to welcome humans into the Federation or classify them as a potential threat. Wars between Federation members were forbidden, but wars with outside species happened regularly when diplomatic solutions failed. The humans claimed they wanted peaceful relations, but their actions suggested they were always ready for combat. Zeftar had been chosen for this mission because of his extensive experience observing military cultures and his reputation for objective reporting. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Travel to human space and observe their military in action. The perfect opportunity had already presented itself. The aggressive Korthic Empire had been raiding human settlements on the frontier world of New Terra. The Korthics were a known quantity. Reptilian warriors who solved problems through brute force and overwhelming numbers. They had recently declared formal war on the human colony and planned a full-scale invasion. The humans had requested Federation assistance, but protocol required observation before intervention. Zeftar would embed with human forces and document their combat effectiveness while remaining strictly neutral. The head counselor handed him the sealed orders and reminded him that his report would influence whether humanity joined the Federation as allies or faced them as enemies. She warned him to be thorough because the Council had learned to be cautious about species that seemed harmless but possessed hidden strengths. The last time they had misjudged a newly contacted race, the results had been 3 years of devastating war before peace could be restored. Zeftar accepted the mission with the confidence that came from decades of experience. He had observed hundreds of species and could usually predict their military capabilities within hours of arrival. Newly spacefaring races typically fought with primitive tactics and basic weapons. They might show courage or determination, but they lacked the advanced strategies and technologies that made truly dangerous opponents. How much trouble could humans really be when they had only discovered faster-than-light travel a few decades ago? The journey to New Terra took 2 weeks aboard a Federation diplomatic vessel. Zeftar spent the time reviewing everything known about human history and culture. The reports painted a picture of a remarkably violent species that had spent most of their existence fighting wars among themselves. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet before they ever left their home world. Their literature and entertainment seemed obsessed with conflict and warfare. Even their sports involved ritualized combat or competition that mimicked battle. This pattern of constant warfare concerned him, but also provided useful context. Species that fought frequently among themselves often developed advanced military skills, but they also tended to be disorganized when facing external threats. Internal conflicts usually meant they had trouble uniting against common enemies. The humans might be individually dangerous, but they probably lacked the discipline and coordination needed for effective large-scale warfare. When he arrived at New Terra, the situation was exactly as described in his briefing. The human colony had been established 5 years earlier and contained about 2 million settlers spread across 3 major cities and dozens of smaller settlements. The Orcs had been conducting raids for months and had recently massed a large fleet in the outer system. Intelligence reports suggested they planned to invade within days with overwhelming force designed to crush human resistance quickly. Colonel Jake Morrison commanded the human military forces on New Terra and agreed to let Zephyr observe their operations. The alien observer expected to meet a typical colonial commander, someone competent enough to maintain order, but inexperienced in real warfare. Instead, he found himself face to face with a calm professional who spoke about the coming battle like he was discussing weather reports. Morrison explained their defensive preparations without any sign of fear or uncertainty. He seemed almost eager for the Orcs to arrive. The human military base was smaller than Zephyr expected, but appeared well organized. Soldiers moved with purpose, and their equipment looked functional, if not particularly advanced. What struck him most was their attitude. Instead of the grim determination he usually saw in defenders preparing for overwhelming odds, these humans seemed almost cheerful. They joked with each other while cleaning weapons and made casual references to the coming battle like it was an entertaining challenge rather than a life or death struggle. Morrison gave him a full briefing on their tactical situation. 12 human warships against an estimated 50 Orc vessels. Ground forces numbering about 10,000 humans against a projected invasion force of at least 50,000 Orcs. By any reasonable military analysis, this was a hopeless situation that should end in quick defeat or negotiated surrender. But Morrison discussed their plans like he expected to win, and his subordinates shared his confidence. Zephyr settled into the quarters. They provided and prepared to document what he assumed would be a brief defensive action, followed by human defeat. He had observed dozens of similar scenarios where newly spacefaring species faced established military powers. A pattern was always the same. Initial resistance followed by inevitable surrender when the technological and numerical advantages became clear. He expected to write a report recommending against Human Federation membership based on their inability to conduct effective warfare against serious opponents. The Orc fleet would arrive tomorrow, and he would finally see how humans actually fought when faced with impossible odds. Based on everything he knew about military science and his decades of experience observing warfare across the galaxy, the outcome seemed obvious. The only question was how long the humans would hold out before admitting defeat. He prepared his recording equipment and settled in to document another routine military observation that would help the Federation make informed decisions about galactic security. The Orc fleet dropped out of hyperspace at dawn with the precision of a military machine that had conquered dozens of worlds. 50 warships arranged themselves in the classic hammer formation that had broken countless defensive lines across the galaxy. Their flagship alone was 3 times larger than the biggest human vessel and bristled with enough firepower to level entire cities. Zefta watched from the bridge of the human command ship as sensors displayed the overwhelming enemy force. Approaching their small defensive fleet. Captain Lisa Hayes commanded the flagship they called USS Defiance and studied the tactical display with the same calm expression Zefter had seen on Colonel Morrison. She was younger than he expected for someone in command of humanity's main battle fleet. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her uniform looked practical rather than ceremonial. When she spoke to her crew, her voice carried quiet authority that suggested extensive combat experience. Despite her apparent youth, the Korthik commander sent the expected surrender command through standard communication channels. His message was brief and threatening as usual for his species. Surrender immediately or face complete destruction. Turn over all military assets and submit to Korthik rule. Any resistance would result in the elimination of all human settlements on New Terra. It was the same ultimatum Zefter had heard dozens of times when powerful fleets faced weaker opponents. Hayes listened to the message without any change in expression, then turned to her communications officer. Her response was equally brief, but contained something Zefter had never heard in similar situations. She told the Korthik commander that his fleet was welcome to try taking their world, but warned him that many of his warriors would not survive the attempt. Then she added something that made the alien observer's skin crawl with unease. She said the humans were looking forward to showing their guests how they handled uninvited visitors. The human fleet immediately began moving into what appeared to be a suicidal attack formation, instead of taking defensive positions or attempting to negotiate. They accelerated directly toward the Korthik battle line. Zefter checked his instruments twice, because the tactical display seemed impossible. 12 small ships charging straight at 50 larger vessels with superior firepower made no military sense, according to everything he knew about space warfare. But as the range closed, he began to see the method behind what looked like madness. The human ships were not flying in the standard formation he expected. Instead, they moved in a complex pattern that seemed random, until he realized they were using each other as shields while concentrating their fire on specific targets. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Brooks coordinated the maneuver from his position on the tactical display, and his calm voice guided the fleet through movements that should have been impossible without months of practice. The first exchange of fire revealed the true nature of human military thinking. While the Korthiks used their standard energy weapons, the humans responded with kinetic projectiles that their opponents had not expected. Metal slugs accelerated to incredible speeds, tore through Korthik shields and armor that were designed to deflect energy beams. The primitive human weapons proved devastatingly effective against an enemy that had prepared for conventional warfare. What disturbed Zefter most was not the tactical surprise, but the obvious enthusiasm of the human crews. Over the open communication channel, he could hear pilots whooping with joy as their shots found targets. Pilot Amy Carson destroyed her 5th Korthik fighter and celebrated like she had won some kind of game rather than killed dozens of enemy warriors. Her laughter echoed through the command bridge, and other crew members joined in, like they were watching entertainment rather than participating in deadly combat. The battle that should have ended in minutes stretched into hours as human tactics proved far more sophisticated than their technology suggested. Commander Kate Sullivan led a boarding party that somehow captured an intact Korthik dreadnought by using the enemy's own docking procedures against them. Her Marines fought through the ship's corridors with weapons that were crude compared to Korthik equipment, but their tactics and determination overcame technological disadvantages that should have been decisive. Zefter realized he was witnessing something completely unprecedented in his decades of military observation. The humans were not just fighting effectively against superior odds. They were enjoying themselves. Major Tony Martinez joked with his boarding team while they cleared enemy compartments room by room. His casual banter with his soldiers suggested this kind of combat was routine for them, rather than a life or death struggle it should have been. The turning point came when the human fleet executed a maneuver that violated every principle of space warfare Zefter had ever learned. Instead of maintaining formation, they scattered into individual units that attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. This should have made them vulnerable to concentrated enemy fire, but somehow they coordinated their movements to support each other while remaining impossible to target effectively. The Korthik formation began to collapse as their commanders struggled to adapt to tactics they had never encountered. Their weapons were superior, and their ships were larger, but they had trained to fight conventional opponents who followed predictable patterns. The humans seemed to make up new strategies in the middle of battle and switch between different approaches. Without any apparent planning or coordination, Hayes directed the final phase of the engagement with the same calm efficiency she had shown from the beginning. Her orders were clear and precise, but she also seemed to be improvising solutions to problems as they developed. When 3 Korthik heavy cruisers tried to break away from the battle, she sent pursuit teams that destroyed them before they could escape. Her explanation was simple and chilling. No enemy vessels would be allowed to leave and report on human capabilities docked by the time the space battle ended. The Korthik fleet had been completely destroyed with minimal human losses. 50 enemy warships reduced to debris and escape pods, while the human fleet remained largely intact. The few surviving Korthik crews were taken prisoner, but Zefter noticed that many of them seemed more shocked than defeated. They kept asking their captors how such primitive opponents had achieved such a decisive victory. The answer became clear as Zefter reviewed the tactical recordings. The humans had not won through superior technology or numbers. They had won because they approached warfare completely differently than any species he had ever observed. Where other races fought to achieve specific objectives or defend their territory, the humans seemed to fight because they genuinely enjoyed the challenge of combat itself. Captain Hayes briefed her officers after the battle, and her assessment was disturbing in its casual tone. She praised individual performances, like a coach reviewing a successful game, rather than a commander analyzing a life or death struggle. Her recommendations for future engagements focused on refining techniques and trying new approaches rather than avoiding combat altogether. The most unsettling moment came when Hayes turned to Zefter and asked if he had enjoyed watching the team battle. Her question was genuine rather than sarcastic, and she seemed puzzled when he did not respond with enthusiasm. She explained that human military doctrine was based on the assumption that warriors who enjoyed their profession would always outfight those who viewed combat as an unpleasant necessity. As reports came in from across the system, Zefter learned that the space battle was only the beginning. Korthak ground forces had already landed on New Terra's surface and established defensive positions. The humans were preparing for a surface campaign that would test their military capabilities in completely different circumstances. Hayes seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity to try their tactics against a different type of enemy. Zefter realized his mission had become far more complex than anyone at the Federation Council had anticipated. These humans were not the typical newly spacefaring species struggling against overwhelming odds. They were something else entirely, and he was no longer sure whether they represented an opportunity for alliance or a threat that needed to be contained before it spread beyond their current borders. The Korthik ground invasion began 3 days after their fleet's destruction, with a precision that showed why they had conquered so many worlds. Despite losing their naval support, they had managed to land over 60,000 warriors on New Terra's surface before the human fleet could intercept all their transport ships. These were not the desperate survivors of a defeated force, but professional soldiers who had studied human settlements and planned their assault carefully. General Ben Carter commanded the human ground forces from Firebase Alpha, which sat on a strategic hilltop overlooking the main colonial city. The base was smaller than Zephyr expected for defending against such overwhelming odds, but Carter seemed confident in his preparations. The fortifications looked solid enough, but hardly seemed capable of withstanding a determined assault by an enemy with 3 times their numbers and superior heavy weapons. Zephyr accompanied Carter on an inspection of the defensive positions and listened to briefings from company commanders who would hold the line against the coming attack. What struck him immediately was how different these humans were from the naval crews he had observed during the space battle. Where the ship crews had been enthusiastic and almost playful, these ground soldiers showed a darker kind of professionalism that made his skin crawl with unease. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez led a squad that specialized in what they called night operations. Her explanation of their role was delivered in a flat tone that somehow made it more disturbing than if she had shown emotion. They would move through enemy lines after dark and eliminate high-value targets while gathering intelligence on Korthik, positions and capabilities. She spoke about killing enemy officers like she was discussing routine maintenance tasks. The first major assault came at dawn on the 4th day with overwhelming force, designed to crush human resistance through sheer numbers. Korthik heavy armor rolled across the plains toward Firebase Alpha, while aerial units provided close support and infantry followed in massive formations. It was a textbook combined arms attack that had broken countless defensive lines across. The Galaxy. Captain Steve Johnson coordinated the artillery response from his position in the base's command bunker. His weapons were primitive compared to what Zephyr had seen other species use, but their effectiveness was undeniable. Kinetic rounds and chemical explosives tore through Korthik formations with devastating precision. But what made the alien observer's stomach turn was not the destruction, but Johnson's obvious satisfaction with the carnage his guns were creating. The human defensive strategy became clear as the battle developed. Instead of trying to stop the Korthik advance, they channeled it into killing zones where concentrated firepower could do maximum damage. Machine gun nests and mortar positions had been carefully positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. That turned the approaches to Firebase Alpha into death traps for any enemy force brave enough or foolish enough to enter them. But the most disturbing aspect of human ground warfare was their apparent enjoyment of close combat. When Korthik infantry finally reached the outer defensive lines, they found themselves facing human soldiers who seemed eager for hand-to-hand fighting. Master Sergeant Linda Davis led a counterattack that drove back enemy forces twice. Her squad sized through pure aggression and tactical skill that bordered on artistry. Zephyr watched Avis fight for over an hour without rest or hesitation. She moved through enemy positions like she had been born for this kind of warfare. Her weapon handling was flawless, and her tactical decisions were made instantly without any apparent thought or planning. She seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they happened, and countered every Korthik attempt to flank, overwhelm her position. What made the scene truly horrifying was that Davis was clearly enjoying herself. Between firefights, she joked with her soldiers and made casual observations about enemy tactics, like she was critiquing a sporting event. When ammunition ran low, she switched to captured Korthik weapons without missing a beat. When those weapons failed, she improvised explosive devices from mining equipment that proved devastatingly effective against enemy armor. The siege continued for days with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. The Korthiks had superior numbers and heavy equipment, but the humans demonstrated an adaptability that their enemies could not match. When conventional weapons ran low, they created new ones from industrial materials. When communications were jammed, they reverted to hand signals and message runners. When surrounded, they dug tunnel networks that allowed them to attack from unexpected directions. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Evans commanded what the humans called ghost squads that operated behind enemy lines. His teams of 12 soldiers each had somehow learned to move through Korthik, controlled territory, without being detected by sensors that should have made stealth impossible. They struck at supply convoys and command posts with perfect timing and disappeared before enemy forces could respond. Zefter accompanied one of these missions and witnessed tactics that defied everything he thought he knew about military science. The human soldiers moved through hostile terrain like they had spent years learning every rock and tree. They communicated through gestures so subtle he could barely detect them. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to enjoy the hunt more than the actual combat. Corporal Nancy Williams collected Korthik rank insignia as trophies and could identify enemy unit types by their equipment and formations. Her knowledge of Korthik military structure was more detailed than most Federation intelligence reports. She had acquired this information through direct observation during combat rather than formal study, and seemed to treat it like an entertaining hobby rather than vital military intelligence. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week when the humans demonstrated their most terrifying capability. Instead of continuing to fight defensively, they began hunting Korthik forces systematically across the entire continent. Small teams of human soldiers moved through enemy-held territory and eliminated isolated units with surgical precision, while larger forces conducted coordinated attacks on major installations. Sergeant Rick Foster kept a detailed journal of these operations, complete with tactical sketches and personal observations about enemy weaknesses. His entries read like technical manuals, but were written with an enthusiasm that suggested he found warfare intellectually fascinating rather than emotionally traumatic. He documented new techniques for defeating Korthik armor and discussed improvements to human weapons with the passion of an artist perfecting his craft. The most disturbing incident occurred when Private First Class Kyle Thompson captured a Korthik communications officer alive during a raid on an enemy forward base. The interrogation that followed revealed information about Korthik command structure and battle plans, but the methods used made Zefter question everything he thought he knew about human civilization. Thompson did not use torture or threats of violence. Instead, he demonstrated an understanding of Korthik psychology that allowed him to manipulate the prisoner into cooperation. His techniques were subtle and effective, but suggested a level of cultural analysis that should have taken years of study to develop. Somehow, this young soldier had learned to think like his enemies well enough to predict their responses and exploit their weaknesses. The intelligence gathered from the prisoner revealed the location of the main Korthik command post and gave the humans an opportunity to end the siege through a decisive strike. But instead of planning a quick assault to eliminate enemy leadership, Colonel Morrison and his staff began designing something far more elaborate and disturbing. Major Julie Barnes explained their strategy during a briefing that made Zefter realize he was dealing with a species that viewed warfare as both science and art. The humans did not just want to defeat their enemies. They wanted to send a message to any other species that might consider humans as easy targets. Their plan was designed to demonstrate capabilities that would discourage future aggression through sheer psychological impact. Captain Alex Stone added details about the operational timeline and resource requirements with the same professional competence Zeftar had observed throughout the siege. But his casual references to the devastating effects their attack would have on enemy morale made it clear that humans understood warfare on levels that other species had never explored. As the final assault preparations began, Zeftar realized he was about to witness something unprecedented in galactic military history. These humans were not just effective warriors. They were artists of destruction who had turned combat into a form of creative expression that combined tactical brilliance with psychological warfare in ways that defied conventional military thinking. The fourth week of the siege marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict that left Zephyr questioning everything he thought he understood about warfare. The Korthiks who had arrived as conquerors now found themselves trapped on a hostile world where every shadow might conceal death and every moment of safety was an illusion that could shatter without warning. The humans had not simply repelled an invasion. They had turned the entire planet into a hunting ground where they were the apex predators. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Evans briefed his officers on the new phase of operations with the same calm professionalism that had characterized human military planning throughout the siege. His ghost squads had mapped every Korthik position across 3 continents and identified weaknesses in their defensive lines that could be exploited through coordinated strikes. But what disturbed Zephyr was not the tactical information, but the obvious pleasure Evans took in describing how they would systematically destroy an enemy force that still outnumbered them 2-1. The first indication of how completely the situation had changed came when Korthik supply convoys began disappearing without trace. These were not random attacks by desperate defenders, but carefully orchestrated operations that eliminated entire enemy units while leaving behind evidence designed to terrorize survivors. Corporal Nancy Williams led a team that intercepted the convoy carrying ammunition and medical supplies to a forward base. Instead of simply destroying the vehicles, they arranged the wreckage in patterns that spelled out messages in Korthik script. Zephyr accompanied the recovery team that found the convoy 3 days later. The sight that greeted them would haunt his dreams for years afterward. The Korthik vehicles had been arranged in a perfect circle with the burned remains of their crews positioned to face outward like sentries guarding against threats that would never come. In the center of the circle, someone had used enemy weapons to carve words in the local language that roughly translated to "Welcome to our world." Sergeant Rick Foster explained the psychological warfare principles behind such displays with the enthusiasm of a teacher discussing his favorite subject. The humans had studied Korthik culture and religious beliefs until they understood exactly what images and symbols would have maximum emotional impact on enemy survivors. These were not random acts of violence, but calculated attacks on enemy morale designed to spread fear throughout their entire force. The terror campaign escalated when human teams began infiltrating Korthik base camps during the night hours when their enemies assumed they were safe behind defensive perimeters. Master Sergeant Linda Davis led raids that penetrated enemy lines with surgical precision and eliminated high-value targets while leaving lower-ranking soldiers alive to spread word of what they had witnessed. The most disturbing aspect of these operations was how the humans seemed to enjoy the hunt more than the actual killing. They would spend days studying enemy patrol patterns and defensive procedures until they could move through hostile territory like ghosts. Davis described the process of stalking enemy officers as intellectually challenging rather than emotionally difficult. She spoke about predicting enemy behavior and exploiting their weaknesses with the same satisfaction other species might show in solving complex puzzles. Captain Derek Watson commanded the engineering units responsible for turning New Terra's infrastructure into weapons against the occupying forces. His teams had spent weeks rigging bridges and tunnels with explosives that could be triggered remotely when enemy units passed through specific locations. But instead of using these devices for immediate tactical advantage, they waited until large formations were in position before triggering devastating chain reactions that eliminated hundreds of enemies simultaneously. The psychological impact of these attacks was immediate and profound. Korthik units began refusing to move through areas where their comrades had disappeared. Patrols that had once moved with confidence now advanced cautiously while checking every rock and tree for signs of human presence. Their communications intercepted by human intelligence teams revealed growing panic among enemy commanders who could not understand how such a primitive species had gained such complete tactical superiority. Private First Class Kyle Thompson had become the unit's expert on Corthic psychology through his interrogations of captured prisoners. His insights into enemy thinking allowed human commanders to predict their responses and stay several steps ahead of their tactical planning. But what made Zefter deeply uncomfortable was Thompson's obvious fascination with the mental processes of his enemies. He spoke about Corthic fear responses and cultural taboos. Like a scientist discussing laboratory specimens, the breakthrough in understanding enemy psychology came when Thompson captured a Corthac battalion commander during a raid on their forward headquarters. The interrogation revealed not just tactical intelligence, but deep insights into how the enemy force was beginning to psychologically collapse under pressure they had never experienced before. The commander described human warfare techniques as violations of every principle his species understood about civilized combat. According to the prisoner Corthic, military doctrine was based on straightforward applications of superior firepower and numerical advantage. Their victories throughout the galaxy had come through overwhelming force applied against opponents who fought according to predictable patterns. The humans violated every assumption about how warfare should be conducted, and their tactics seemed designed more to terrorize than to achieve conventional military objectives. Lieutenant Sarah Kim led heavy weapons teams that had adapted their equipment for mobile operations that allowed them to strike at enemy positions from unexpected angles before disappearing into terrain that should not have provided adequate concealment. Her gunners had learned to work in perfect coordination without verbal communication and could deliver devastating firepower with an accuracy that enemy forces could not match despite their superior technology. The turning point came when human forces began systematically hunting individual Corthic soldiers who had become separated from their units. These were not combat operations in any conventional sense, but elaborate games where human teams would track their prey for days before closing in for kills that seemed designed more for entertainment than military necessity. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez described these hunts with an enthusiasm that made Zefter's skin crawl with revulsion. The most horrifying incident occurred when a squad of Corthic scouts became lost in the wilderness during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. Human trackers found them within hours, but instead of eliminating them immediately, they began a psychological campaign that lasted for days. The enemy soldiers were allowed to think they were escaping, while human teams manipulated their route and influenced their decisions through carefully placed evidence and subtle environmental modifications. By the time the Corthic scouts were finally captured, they had been driven to the edge of madness by paranoia and exhaustion. Their rescue became impossible when human teams eliminated the search parties sent to find them. The few survivors who made it back to their base reported experiences that their commanders initially dismissed as hallucinations caused by stress and sleep deprivation. Captain Steve Johnson coordinated artillery strikes that had evolved far beyond conventional fire support into precision instruments for psychological warfare. His gunners could place rounds with surgical accuracy to create specific emotional responses in enemy troops. Buildings were destroyed in ways that maximized visual impact while minimizing actual strategic value. The goal was not to eliminate enemy positions, but to demonstrate that nowhere was safe from human reach. Major Tony Martinez led Marine units that had perfected techniques for urban warfare that turned enemy-held cities into death traps where every building might conceal threats and every street corner could become a killing zone. His soldiers moved through hostile territory with the confidence of apex predators who had no natural enemies. They seemed to genuinely enjoy the challenge of fighting against overwhelming odds in environments that should have favored the defenders. The final phase of the psychological campaign began when human forces started broadcasting recordings of their operations directly to enemy communication networks. These were not propaganda messages, but actual audio from combat operations, where human soldiers could be heard laughing and joking while they systematically destroyed Korthek units. The psychological impact on enemy morale was devastating and immediate. Captain Alex Stone explained that the recordings served multiple purposes beyond simple intimidation. They demonstrated human tactical capabilities while suggesting that these warriors treated combat as entertainment rather than serious work. Enemy commanders who heard their soldiers being eliminated while their killers celebrated, like they were playing games, began to understand that they faced opponents unlike anything in their military experience. As the fourth week ended, Zefter realized he was witnessing the complete psychological collapse of a military force that had conquered dozens of worlds through conventional superiority. The final assault on the Korthek command complex was scheduled for dawn on the 31st day of the siege, but Zefter knew the real battle had ended weeks earlier when the enemy's will to fight collapsed under psychological pressure no military force should have been able to withstand. What he was about to witness was not combat in any conventional sense, but a demonstration designed to send a message that would echo across the galaxy for generations. Colonel Jake Morrison gathered his senior officers in the command bunker and outlined an operation so complex and devastating that it challenged every assumption about what newly spacefaring species should be capable of achieving. The plan required perfect coordination between ground forces, artillery units, engineering teams, and special operations squads working across multiple continents simultaneously. Most disturbing of all, it was designed not just to defeat the remaining Korthak forces, but to ensure no enemy survivor could ever doubt the consequences of threatening human worlds. Patricia Young commanded the deception operation that would lure the remaining enemy forces into a trap so elaborate it bordered on artistic expression. Her teams had spent days creating false intelligence that would convince Korthek commanders their best chance for survival lay in concentrating their scattered units for a final desperate assault on Firebase Alpha. The psychological profile of enemy leadership developed through weeks of observation suggested they would respond predictably to threats against their perceived honor and military competence. Captain Derek Watson's engineers had transformed the entire battlefield into a weapon that could be activated through remote control systems hidden throughout the terrain. Bridges that appeared intact would collapse under the weight of enemy armor. Roads that seemed safe would become killing fields when explosives buried beneath the surface detonated in carefully timed sequences. Even the weather had been modified through cloud seeding operations that would create fog banks at precisely the moments when human forces needed concealment. The deception began before sunrise when human artillery units fired ranging shots that appeared to miss their targets by significant margins. Sergeant Rick Foster coordinated the final phase of the operation with the same methodical precision he had shown throughout the siege. His teams had studied Korthak cultural traditions and religious beliefs until they understood exactly how to arrange the battlefield aftermath for maximum psychological impact on any survivors. The positions of fallen enemies and the placement of captured equipment followed patterns that would be instantly recognizable to any member of their species as symbols of complete defeat and dishonor, not the systematic destruction of the Korthak force. Took less than 6 hours, but felt like an eternity to Zefter, who watched from his observation post with growing horror. This was not warfare as he understood it, but something far more disturbing. The humans had turned combat into a form of artistic expression that combined tactical brilliance with psychological manipulation and genuine enthusiasm for violence, in ways that defied every principle of civilized behavior. Captain Steve Johnson's artillery units delivered the coup de grace with barrages so precisely timed and targeted that they seemed choreographed rather than calculated. Each salvo eliminated specific enemy positions while leaving evidence of human capabilities that would be impossible for any survivor to misinterpret. The message was clear and terrifying. Humanity possessed weapons and tactics that could destroy any enemy force, regardless of technological advantages or numerical superiority. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scope of what Morrison and his staff had accomplished. The Korthok invasion force that had landed with over 60,000 warriors had been reduced to fewer than 3,000 scattered survivors, who were too traumatized to offer organized resistance. Most of them surrendered without fighting when human patrols reached their hiding places. The few who attempted to continue fighting were eliminated with surgical precision that demonstrated complete tactical dominance. Major Julie Barnes conducted the interrogation of senior Korthok officers with techniques that extracted detailed information about their military organization and strategic planning. Her methods were subtle and effective, but suggested an understanding of enemy psychology that should have required years of cultural study to develop. She seemed to find the process intellectually fascinating rather than emotionally difficult, and discussed her findings with colleagues like a researcher sharing interesting discoveries. The most disturbing moment came when the surviving Korthok commander requested a formal meeting with Morrison to discuss surrender terms. The conversation that followed revealed the complete psychological collapse of a military force that had conquered dozens of worlds through conventional superiority. The enemy officer could not understand how primitive humans had achieved such devastating victory against technologically superior opponents. Morrison's explanation was brief and chilling. He told the Korthok commander that humanity had spent thousands of years fighting wars among themselves and had learned to treat combat as both science and art. Their military doctrine was based on the assumption that warriors who genuinely enjoyed their profession would always defeat those who viewed warfare as an unpleasant necessity. The humans had not won through superior technology, but through superior understanding of what warfare really meant. The surrender ceremony took place at sunset, with the few surviving Korthok officers formally transferring authority over their remaining forces to human commanders. But instead of accepting the surrender, Morrison made an announcement that sent chills through Zeftar's entire body. The humans would not be taking prisoners or establishing occupation forces. Instead, they would be providing transportation for all survivors to return to Korthok space with a message for their government and military leadership. That message was simple and absolute. Any future aggression against human worlds would result in consequences far beyond what their enemies had experienced on New Terra. Humanity possessed capabilities that made conventional military analysis meaningless, and they were prepared to demonstrate those capabilities against any species foolish enough to threaten their interests. The survivors would serve as living testimony to what happened when established. Galactic powers underestimated human resolve. Captain Alex Stone supervised the loading of Korthok survivors onto the transport ships that would carry them home. His casual efficiency in organizing the evacuation made it clear this had been planned from the beginning rather than improvised after victory. The humans had never intended to occupy enemy territory or negotiate favorable peace terms. Their goal had been to create living witnesses who would spread word of human capabilities throughout the galaxy. As the last Korthok transport disappeared into hyperspace, Zeftar realized he faced an impossible decision about his report to the Federation Council. Everything he had witnessed suggested that humanity represented something completely unprecedented in galactic history. They were not just another newly spacefaring species seeking membership in the established order. They were apex predators who had weaponized their own savage nature and turned warfare into a form of creative expression that combined tactical brilliance with genuine enthusiasm for violence. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Human military capabilities far exceeded what their technology should have allowed. Their tactical innovations challenged every assumption about how civilized species should conduct warfare. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to genuinely enjoy combat in ways that other races found psychologically impossible to understand or predict. Morrison approached him as he prepared to depart New Terra and asked for his assessment of human military effectiveness. The question was posed with genuine curiosity rather than arrogance or defensiveness. The colonel seemed interested in feedback that might help improve their performance in future engagements rather than seeking validation for what they had already accomplished. Zeftis' response was carefully measured, but he could not disguise his fundamental unease with what he had observed. He told Morrison that human capabilities exceeded anything in his decades of military observation across the galaxy. Their tactical innovations and psychological warfare techniques represented evolutionary advances in combat effectiveness that would force other species to completely reconsider their assumptions about warfare itself. Morrison's reaction was typically human. He thanked Zefter for the compliment and suggested that the Federation might benefit from closer military cooperation with humanity. His casual confidence in making such suggestions revealed the complete transformation that had occurred during the siege. The humans no longer saw themselves as supplicants seeking acceptance into galactic civilization. They had become equals who expected to be treated with the respect their capabilities demanded. The journey back to Federation space gave Zefter time to prepare his report, but the task seemed impossible. How could he explain to the Council that humanity represented something completely outside their experience? These were not typical newly spacefaring primitives who could be guided into proper civilized behavior.